In this case, what we decided to do was, again, another spin-off, was to try to assess whether there are forms of specialized journalism that have different views or different self-perceptions about the role of journalism, as well as their influences on their jobs, and as well as ethics dimensions. So we also conveyed some research on sport journalism, political journalism, and cultural journalism. So from the total sample of 296 journalists, 100 of them belong to the general survey of the World of Journalism project. We made another 100 survey for sport journalism, and then the remaining ones are 63 for political journalism and 33 for cultural journalism. We believe it's a very representative sample of the whole universe that we're talking about. And again, you have all the media outlets that we looked at. So I gave 2 minutes away to my colleague, Monica. She was a little bit stressed up, so I'll make a turbo presentation of the results. We didn't find any significant statistical variables, as we were expecting to. We thought that editorials meant something in terms of the results. Specialized journalism have their specificities and idiosyncrasies that would show up in the results. Eventually they didn't. So in terms of their role, in terms of the perception that they have towards the neutrality of being a neutraliter or a detached observer, most of them agreed on the same pattern, although with different results. The general sample showed a 70% agreement with that. In the case of the cultural journalists, only 30% thought it to be very relevant. In terms of the other, you can see there is not a lot of differences, except for this idea of the journalists not being very much interested in providing relevant information. They prefer to commit themselves to setting the agenda. I think it's a very important topic here, as well as the sport journalism do. 52% of them agree it's very highly relevant to do this. As on the other side, you can say that in general, journalists surveyed, they were not really interested in setting the agenda. Only 71% of the survey journalists said it was not important to set the agenda, which is a rather interesting result. As for the ethics, again, you have very similar results. 95% of all surveyed journalists agree that you should have a sort of a absolutist or universalist approach to ethics. So universal rules should apply to all cases. You should not look at it in an ad hoc situation, except for this idea that if harm is involved, then you should consider or reconsider this idea. So they are at the same time absolutists and exceptionists regarding ethical issues. And I should say this, we only looked at the 20 weight questions from the whole survey that were common to all these editorial news sections. But the other study that we did, it also involves about phone hacking. And in Portugal, it's considered to be acceptable if a harmful situation is involved. And then for the last thing that we were looking at in terms of the influences to the journalism work, we looked at 18 different ones. And what showed up in the result is mostly intra-media considerations show up in terms of the journalist's self-perception. They consider some of the conventions in terms of journalism to be important, that impact upon their work, whereas external influences do not show up a lot. So big corporations, they don't show up. 57% of the journalists say they don't play any role, they don't have any influence on their work. Advertisers, again, 57%, they say no influence at all, no impact at all. And lastly, journalism trade unions, 73% of the journalists said they don't have a clue on our work and what we're doing. Okay, so mostly it's involving this idea of internal conventions and internal factors that impact. So other aspects that also didn't show up in the results, that didn't show any significant differences were, for instance, peer pressure from your own colleagues, from your own newsroom. Sport journalists said it was sometimes important, 51%, whereas the general interviewed journalists said not important at all. Only 18% of them said sometimes it makes an impact on their work. What about intermedia agenda setting? That idea that we have that when someone publishes a news report on an issue, then the other press should follow along and trail. Well, in our case, we found that 44% of the sport journalists consider to be important, highly relevant, whereas 58% of the general inquired journalists believe it's not influenced at all. So you see a difference, but in terms of statistics, it's not representative at all. So come to the conclusion before I get any signs from our chair. He's really worried about the time. And the main conclusion is usually don't find a lot of differences. And our argument is that there are some specificities of the Portuguese journalism that account for this. And also, part of the explanation for this would be our initial sample from the general journalists. We believe it's very representative of all branches of journalism, which to some extent explain why we found so many similarities and not differences. Thank you.
Very concise account. So
Told you. I'm used to turbo presentations already.
Yes.
And University of Sydney. I was interested to know whether the Journalists Union has a code of ethics.
They do?
So that's what the journalists would be referring to, say professional ethics.
Yeah. Yeah. And they do apply to it.
And what is the percentage of working journalists, could you know, who are in the union?
In the union, it's about 60%. But it's a unique situation, okay? The thing that is going on in Portugal at the moment is the press has disclosed that they have had some pressures from one of the ministers in the government. And they said that the minister phoned them up to say, do not run this story. And if you do, we'll never give you any interviews. We won't give you any pub, any advertising. And we'll print some material on the private life of the journalists on the web, which is very nice.
So, if there are no more, we'll move on. So thanks very much.
You're welcome.
So now we have John lllman playing at home from the University.
Playing at home, yes indeed. Anthony, I actually timed my talk to last for 15 minutes. If I exceed the 12 minutes, let me know and I shall shut up. And I'm talking about medical journalism, and before any of you ask, my name is John lllman. It really is my name, despite what I've done all these years. I've heard all the jokes about my name. But there we go. Just get this out. From the beginning? Yeah, got it. Right, I work as the medical tutor on the medical journalism course at the Harrow campus, and I've also been very, very lucky to have had a number of really fabulous jobs. A lot of people look at my CV and they think, well, how can you possibly have worked for the Daily Mail and the Guardian? And you may be surprised to hear this, but I wouldn't have got my job on the Guardian without my job first on the Daily Mail. Peter Preston, who was editor of the Guardian when I started there, was a great admirer of Daily Mail journalism, which may come as a surprise, but there we are. Before I did these jobs, I spent some years working on regional and weekly newspapers in the UK, which meant that increasingly I saw my world and my job through news values. We could debate a long time about what news values actually mean, but just for the sake of this talk, let's accept that these factors encompass most of them. And I think as measures of newsworthiness, news values work extremely well in areas such as crime or politics. But how well do they work in what's really been given in academic circles? And I think that is a vacuum that someone should fill. Let's talk specifically now about case histories, what makes a winner and what makes a loser. Can I also ask at this stage, how many of you here have actually been working journalists, on-the-road journalists? Most people. Okay, but a few haven't. So you all know what TOT stands for. No? Triumph over tragedy. This is one of the core constituents of a medical case history. And on the face of it, you may think, well, there's nothing wrong with that, is there? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that there can be a great deal wrong with it. Anyway, on the left-hand side, you see a lot of the core constituents that get fed into case histories, and on the right-hand side, you see the news values. And the more of these things you have in any one case history, the more likely it is to fly. Now, here is the downside of the triumph over tragedy approach to case histories. This was actually taken from a piece that I wrote about Angela Wilkie in The Guardian in the late 1980s, but it is still as pertinent today as it is then, because in fact very, very little has changed. In fact, nothing has changed. And I think this is one of the issues that medical journalism should be addressing. And I'm reminded here of a woman that I used to know, a GP in Oxford called Anne McPherson, and she died actually last year from ovarian cancer, but before that she developed breast cancer, and she was determined to find out as much as she could about what it was like to live with breast cancer from a purely personal perspective as opposed to her professional perspective as a GP. And she looked to the media to do this, and she was bitterly disappointed because she kept coming across these stories about cancer patients who just climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, cancer patients who just climbed Everest, or who rode across the Atlantic. And just think about the deafening effect, the powerful impact that is going to have on most people who have cancer, who are never going to climb Mount Everest in their lives. They're just going to be made to feel totally inadequate. And I think this is something that's really, really important. And actually, one of the things I want to say, listening here this morning, the emphasis on this meeting so far has been, to a great extent, on the Westminster bubble.